the 22nd of September, 1980, as dawn broke over the Iranian plateau, a new kind of thunder cracked across the sky. It wasn't weather. It was war. Over 200 Iraqi warplanes screamed low across the border, targeting Iranian air bases, radar installations, and key command nodes. In the cockpits, pilots gripped their controls, certain they were launching a surgical campaign, a lightning strike that would end in glory and rewrite the balance of the Middle East. They were half right. The war did rewrite the region, but it did not end in glory. And it certainly wasn't short. This was no ordinary border skirmish. This was the beginning of one of the longest and most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War. A war driven not just by land, oil, and religion, but by revolution, fear, and the ghosts of two empires trying to resurrect themselves. The question is not just why it happened, but why it didn't stop, and how, 8 years later, it left the region burning in ways we still feel today. The story begins not in 1980, but 12 years earlier, in Baghdad. On the 17th of July, 1968, the Ba'ath Party seized power in Iraq, blending Arab nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism. They established a new regime, one that promised unity, modernity, and strength. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr became president, but his vice president, a ruthless, calculating man named Saddam Hussein, quickly became the real architect of Iraq's destiny. Over the next decade, Saddam built Iraq's economy with oil wealth, launched massive infrastructure projects, and purged enemies with brutal efficiency. By July 1979, he had taken full control. His first act, broadcasting the execution of 22 Ba'ath Party members in front of the Central Committee, a blood ritual meant to consolidate fear and loyalty. It worked. Saddam ruled Iraq like an iron architect, designing not just a nation, but a myth of strength. But even myths crack, because for all his calls for pan-Arab unity, Iraq was a fragmented house. Its Sunni minority ruled over a Shia majority, and its Arab identity ignored the deep roots of the Kurdish population, who saw themselves not as Arab brothers but as a people apart. Behind Saddam's theatrics and parades, the foundation trembled. But just across the border, something even more explosive was happening. In Iran, an entirely different revolution was brewing. For decades, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled with Western backing. He was the West's favorite autocrat, secular, modern, loyal to Washington. He bought American jets, hosted lavish galas, and sold oil with confidence. But under the glitter, there was fire. Industrialization had created inequality. Westernization had bred resentment. And the secret police Savak silenced dissent with torture and fear. By 1978, Iran erupted. Mosques became command centers. Millions marched in the streets. And behind it all, a black turban cleric in exile, Ruhollah Khomeini, called from Paris for the people to overthrow the Shah and create a government of divine rule. In February 1979, the Shah fled. Khomeini returned, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was born not with ballots, but with banners and bayonets. It was a moment of spiritual euphoria and strategic chaos. Iran, once Washington's most stable ally in the region, had become a revolutionary theocracy, denouncing the United States as the Great Satan and calling for the export of Islamic revolution across the Muslim world. For Saddam Hussein, this was not just ideology, this was an existential threat. As Iran convulsed, Saddam saw opportunity. Iran's army had been purged, its officers jailed, its institutions fractured by the revolution's zealotry. Meanwhile, Saddam saw his own Shia majority watching the Ayatollah with admiration. The idea of a Shia revolution spreading into Iraq was not just paranoia, it was probable. So Saddam did what strongmen always do when they feel weak. He launched a war, but it wasn't only to contain the revolution. Saddam had strategic aims. First, reclaim the Shatt al-Arab waterway, Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf. Second, capture Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich province, home to a large Arab population. Third, topple Iran's new government before it could stabilize. It was meant to be swift, bold, and victorious. It would be none of those things. The invasion began at 2 p.m. on the 22nd of September. Iraqi tanks and troops crossed the border along 3 major fronts. Artillery rained down. Jets roared overhead. In the first week, Iraq seized several border towns. But the Iranian Air Force, despite purges, responded fiercely. They destroyed 30 Iraqi planes in the opening days. And within weeks, Iran had regained air superiority, flying daring missions deep into Iraqi territory. On the ground, Iran's forces were battered but determined. Elite Revolutionary Guards, poorly armed militias, and remnants of the old army fought back with trench knives, tanks, and ideology. In Khorramshahr, outnumbered Iranian defenders fought a brutal month-long urban battle, stalling Saddam's advance at the cost of thousands of lives. The city became known as the City of Blood. By October 1980, it was clear this would not be a war of weeks. It would be a war of attrition, endurance, and total national mobilization. And instead of dividing Iran, the invasion unified it. Behind the Ayatollah's call, millions of Iranians volunteered for the front lines. Children carried plastic keys to paradise. Mothers kissed sons goodbye with prayers, not tears. For the first time in decades, the Iranian nation had a common enemy, and Saddam had just made him stronger. By the end of 1980, the front lines had frozen. Saddam Hussein, who had once vowed to conquer Khuzestan in mere days, found himself bogged down in trenches, watching a revolutionary Iran rise. But if the war had solidified Iran's internal cohesion, Iraq's political gamble was also transforming into something far more dangerous. This was no longer just a battle over territory or oil fields. It had become a test of ideologies, of survival, and increasingly of personal legacies. And both leaders, Saddam Hussein and Ayatollah Khomeini, were equally unwilling to lose. In January 1981, Iran made its first attempt to turn the tide. Operation Nasser Victory was an ambitious counteroffensive designed to relieve the Iraqi siege of Dezful and push Iraqis back across the border. Iranian forces deployed their best remaining equipment: American-made M60 Patton tanks, British Chieftain tanks, and hastily trained Islamic Revolutionary Guard units, still steeped in religious fervor. But fervor could not outgun artillery. The Iraqis, having anticipated the attack, countered with pre-sighted artillery and entrenched armor. In just 4 days of battle, hundreds of Iranian tanks were destroyed. Worse, the failure ignited political chaos in Tehran. Iran's president, a key proponent of the offensive, was impeached, and violent clashes broke out between different factions in the new Islamic regime. Out of this chaos, Ayatollah Khomeini's faction emerged stronger, consolidating power. sidelining moderates, and drawing Iran deeper into war, even as Iran cannibalized its own equipment, stripping aircraft for parts, trading oil for munitions, and making shadowy deals to buy arms from unlikely allies. It refused to back down. And in one of the great historical ironies of the conflict, America and Israel quietly helped Iran. Despite the public enmity, both countries saw strategic advantage in prolonging the war. A weakened Iran and Iraq would mean neither could dominate the region, so in the shadows of geopolitics, arms flowed through intermediaries, back channels, and bribes. By contrast, Saddam faced no such ambiguity. He received direct support from the Soviet Union, France, Brazil, and even Egypt. Guns, helicopters, tanks, they all poured into Baghdad. But this support came at a cost. With oil prices falling and the war dragging on, Saddam began borrowing heavily, up to $1 billion a month from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The irony was cruel. The war he started to enhance Iraq's position was now bankrupting it, and his easy victory had become a bleeding wound. Yet by September 1981, Iran was ready again. This time, their offensive was bolder and smarter. They launched an attack to recapture Abadan, a vital port city under siege. And unlike Operation Nasr, this time, the attack succeeded. The Iraqi troops, caught off guard, abandoned equipment, and fell back across the river. Iranian forces captured over 60 armored vehicles and dozens of artillery pieces. For the first time, morale in Tehran soared, and with it, Saudid ambition. In March 1982, Iran unleashed Operation Undeniable Victory, a full-scale counteroffensive across the southern front. Using tactics reminiscent of World War I, Iranian forces opened with massive artillery bombardments, followed by waves of infantry assaults, many composed of teenage volunteers carrying Qurans and wearing keys to paradise around their necks. Iraq's defenses buckled. Iran recaptured Dezful, took 15 Iraqi prisoners, and set his sights on Khorramshahr, the symbolic prize lost early in the war. By April 1982, Iran launched a second battle for Khorramshahr. Shrouded in fog, urban combat raged, block by block. Iranian tanks punched through the Iraqi lines, while Revolutionary Guards cleared buildings with grenades and prayers. The Iraqi army collapsed, and Khorramshahr fell. It was a monumental victory. The myth of Saddam's invincibility was shattered, and Iran, bloodied but unbroken, stood poised on the edge of Iraqi territory. But instead of stopping, Khomeini made a fateful decision. He declared that Iran would not just liberate its lands, it would now topple Saddam Hussein. The war had morphed again from defense to vengeance to revolution exported at the barrel of a gun. And as the Ayatollah famously declared, "We will march on Karbala and we will pray in Baghdad." In July 1982, Iran launched Operation Ramadan. Almost 1 million Iranian troops surged across the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Their goal? Reach Basra, Iraq's second largest city, and trigger the collapse of Saddam's regime. Iraq, realizing what was at stake, erected a massive defensive system dubbed the Iron Ring. It was one of the most sophisticated trench networks built since World War II. Minefields, concrete bunkers, overlapping machine gun nests, and mobile artillery created a killing ground. Iran broke through the first 5 rings, but the 6th held. What followed was a grinding 3-month siege, marked by relentless human wave attacks, chemical weapons, and horrific casualties. Ultimately, Iran suffered over 10,000 dead and was forced to retreat. Basra had survived. Saddam had stopped the revolution at the gates of his oil capital, but it was a Pyrrhic victory bought with mustard gas, blood, and an army stretched thin. Still, Iran would not stop, and Saddam knew he was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. By 1983, the war had entered its most brutal phase, a stalemate of attrition. Neither side could gain decisive ground, and both began embracing unconventional and inhumane tactics: chemical attacks on soldiers and civilians, ballistic missile strikes on cities, and the horrifying deployment of child soldiers at the front lines. This was not just a war between nations. It was a war between egos, ideologies, and the deep trauma of two civilizations unraveling themselves in the name of victory. And behind every decision, behind every offensive and retreat, was the looming question: how much is too much when the enemy is everything you fear becoming? By 1985, 5 years into the war, both Iran and Iraq were bleeding. Not just soldiers, but economies, infrastructure, and the very fabric of their societies. And yet, neither side showed any willingness to negotiate, because by now, the war was no longer just about borders. It was about legitimacy. For Saddam Hussein, survival meant proving that Iraq could resist Iran and, by extension, the Shia revolution he feared would consume his country. For Ayatollah Khomeini, compromise meant betrayal, not just of Iran, but of God's will, peace. For both men had become impossible, because to make peace was to admit that everything they sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives had been for nothing. On the battlefield, Iran still had momentum. Despite international sanctions and limited resources, it continued to launch offensives, often with shocking levels of manpower, but its tactics were archaic: lines of poorly equipped infantry, charging minefields and trenches. In early 1986, Iran stunned the world by capturing the Al-Fal Peninsula, a narrow strip of land at the head of the Persian Gulf. This wasn't just symbolic. It cut off Iraq's access to the sea, threatened its oil exports, and gave Iran a staging point for further attacks on Basra. The victory emboldened Iran. By now, Tehran has secured over $1 billion in weapons from China, North Korea, and Eastern Europe. Despite being labeled a pariah, Iran had become a master of backdoor deals and barter trades. The war machine was well fed. Then came 1987. Iran amassed its largest force, yet over 200,000 troops, including elite Revolutionary Guards, armor divisions, and artillery units for a final push. Their objective was clear: Basra must fall, and if Basra fell, Baghdad could be next. The operation was codenamed Karbala, -5, invoking the Shia martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala, symbolizing Iran's fight against tyranny. But Iraq had prepared. Saddam had turned Basra into a fortress, surrounded by concentric rings of defense, dikes, flame traps, and chemical stockpiles. The battle began in January 1987, and within days, Iranian troops had broken through 5 of the 6 rings. They were inside the city's eastern suburbs, and Iraqi command nearly collapsed. But Saddam responded with ferocity.